At approximately 4:15 in the morning, on June 5, 1944, the most consequential room in the world was a former library inside a Georgian manor house called Southwick House. Set in wet woodlands north of Portsmouth, England, rain hammered the window glass. Outside, gale-force winds shook the trees so hard that branches cracked in the dark. The roads leading to the house had turned to mud. The English Channel, 2 miles south, was a chaos of white-capped waves and driving spray. Inside that library, a group of men in military uniform sat on sofas and armchairs arranged around a blue carpet. They were among the most powerful officers in the world. They commanded fleets and armies and air forces. They held in their hands the lives of hundreds of thousands of men, and they were waiting for one person to speak. That person stood. He clasped his hands behind his back. He lowered his chin to his chest. He began pacing the blue carpet in silence. No one interrupted him. The only sounds were the rain against the glass, the wind outside, and the soft rhythm of boot leather on wool. He paced for 30 to 45 seconds. Then he stopped. He looked at the men around him, and in one of the most widely cited accounts of that moment, he said 4 words. He said, "Okay, we'll go." With those 4 words, General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, committed the largest military operation in the history of warfare to its moment of decision. He committed 156,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen to the beaches and skies above Normandy, France. He committed himself, alone, to whatever came next. And he walked back out into the rain, carrying a note in his wallet that he hoped he would never have to use. This is the story of what led to those 4 words, of what he said to his commanders, and to his men, and to himself, in the weeks and days and hours before he said them. Dwight David Eisenhower had not been born to command. He had grown up in Abilene, Kansas, the 3rd of 7 sons in a poor family of Mennonite heritage. His father worked in a creamery. His mother was a pacifist who wept when her son told her he had accepted an appointment to the United States Military Academy. He graduated from West Point in 1915, 61st in a class of 164. He never commanded troops in combat before World War II. He had spent much of his career as a staff officer, advising generals whose names have long since faded from memory. But Eisenhower possessed something that no military academy teaches and no amount of battlefield experience guarantees. He had the ability to hold together an enormous coalition of powerful, often difficult men without letting any single personality destroy the mission. He had the capacity to absorb pressure that would have broken lesser commanders, and he had a moral seriousness about the weight of command that set him apart from almost everyone around him. He arrived in London on January 14, 1944, having been named Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in late December of 1943. The appointment surprised some observers. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, the British Chief of the Imperial General Staff, had wanted the command for a British officer and had briefly expected it for himself. Some of Eisenhower's own subordinates, men with longer combat records, privately doubted whether a staff officer was the right choice. What those doubters missed was that Overlord was not primarily a combat command. It was a political and managerial enterprise of staggering complexity, requiring someone who could coordinate between American and British armies, between ground and air and naval forces with entirely different institutional cultures, and between political leaders with entirely different strategic visions. Eisenhower was precisely the right person for that work. His senior team included Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who would command the Allied ground forces for the initial landings. It included Admiral Bertram Ramsay of the Royal Navy, who would command the naval operation codenamed Neptune. It included Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder as Eisenhower's deputy, and Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, commanding the Allied Expeditionary Air Force. His chief of staff was Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, a hard-driving American who served as the instrument of Eisenhower's will throughout the campaign. Major General Kenneth Strong handled intelligence. One of the first things Eisenhower did after arriving in London was push for a significant expansion of the existing plan. The original design for Overlord, developed by a British planning staff under Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, called for 3 infantry divisions landing across a relatively narrow front. Eisenhower and Montgomery both agreed this was too narrow. Too many men funneled through too few beaches would create a bottleneck that a determined German counterattack could exploit. Eisenhower backed Montgomery's proposal to expand the assault to 5 divisions across a 50-mile front, adding a beach on the western end near the Cotentin Peninsula and another on the eastern end near the Orne River. Acquiring the additional landing craft needed for this wider assault meant accepting a 1-month postponement from May to early June. Eisenhower accepted the delay without hesitation. Getting the plan right mattered more than getting it done quickly. Together, these men were responsible for an operation whose scale staggers the imagination even now. The naval component alone would deploy nearly 7,000 vessels, crewed by approximately 195,000 sailors from 8 nations. Allied air forces would fly more than 14,000 sorties on June 6 alone. On the ground, 5 infantry divisions would land across 5 separate beaches, with airborne forces securing each flank in darkness before the ships arrived. No one had ever mounted an amphibious assault of this size against a defended coastline held by a modern army. The failed British and Canadian raid at Dieppe in August of 1942, in which nearly 6,000 men had been committed, and nearly half of them killed or captured in a single morning, stood as a reminder of what could go wrong. Overlord had to succeed on a scale Dieppe had not even approached. To understand what was at stake in June of 1944, you have to understand where the war stood. Germany had been at war since September of 1939. By the spring of 1944, German forces occupied most of Western Europe, held a fortified coastline stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, and were still fighting a massive war of attrition against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. Adolf Hitler had ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a system of concrete bunkers, artillery positions, anti-tank obstacles, and millions of mines designed to make any Allied landing attempt enormously costly. The man charged with strengthening that wall was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B. Rommel had spent the winter of 1943 to 1944 travelling its length and ordering improvements at a frantic pace. He added millions of mines to the beaches. He drove wooden stakes into tidal flats and fitted them with explosive charges. He ordered steel obstacles angled toward the sea that would tear the hull from any landing craft striking them. He believed the decisive moment would come in the first hours of any landing. If the assault could be thrown back into the sea on that first day, he told his officers, the war in the West could still be saved. The Soviet Union had carried the heaviest burden of the war against Germany. By 1944, Soviet military and civilian losses had reached into the tens of millions. At the Tehran Conference in November of 1943, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin had extracted a firm commitment from American President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to open a second front in Western Europe no later than May of 1944. This was not a polite request. It was a condition of continued alliance. The political stakes extended further still. The first German V-1 flying bomb struck East London at 4:25 in the morning on June 13, 1944, exactly 1 week after D-Day. The launch sites for the V-1 and the V-2 ballistic rocket were concentrated along the coastline of northern France and Belgium, precisely the territory Overlord was designed to capture. A failed invasion would have left those sites intact and in German hands for months or years longer. Churchill, who had opposed the cross-channel invasion concept for years and had advocated instead for operations through the Mediterranean, had been slowly and reluctantly brought around. He worried the channel would run red with the blood of young Allied soldiers. Even on the eve of the invasion, he had not entirely shed that fear. But by the spring of 1944, the combined weight of Allied planning, American strategic pressure, and the Soviet alliance had made the decision irreversible. If the invasion failed, the next attempt would face a German military that had learned from the first, reinforced, better positioned, more determined. The moon and tidal combination required for the assault recurred on only 3 days in each lunar month. After June, the next viable window was more than 2 weeks away. The political will to ask young men to climb back into landing craft after a bloody failure might have taken years to rebuild. The invasion would happen. It would happen in Normandy. And it would happen at the beginning of June, 1944. Or it would not happen at all. Through the months of January, February, March, April and May of 1944, the coast of southern England was transformed into a vast military camp. More than 1 million Allied soldiers, sailors and airmen were concentrated in that narrow strip of land. Ports were packed with ships. Airfields were crowded with transport planes, bombers, and fighters. Roads were clogged with tanks, trucks, and artillery. The men in those camps knew, in general terms, that something enormous was coming. They were sealed in their billets as the spring advanced, unable to send uncensored mail, unable to make telephone calls, cut off from civilian life. They cleaned their weapons, studied their maps, attended briefings, and waited. Meanwhile, Eisenhower smoked up to 4 packs of Camel cigarettes a day and drank 15 to 20 cups of black coffee. He suffered from hypertension and recurring migraines. He slept badly. He read Zane Grey Western novels in the small hours when sleep would not come. His letters to General George Marshall in Washington traced the steady accumulation of pressure. He wrote in April of 1944 that each day brought definite progress, but that the problems were seemingly intricate and difficult beyond belief. He wrote in May that he wished the assault could go off the next morning. He wrote on June 1st, 1944, just 5 days before the landing, that everyone was in good heart, and that barring unsuitable meteorological conditions, they would do the trick as scheduled. During those months, he fought a series of battles that had nothing to do with the beaches of Normandy, but everything to do with whether the landing would succeed. The most important was over the transportation plan. Professor Solly Zuckerman, scientific advisor at the Allied Expeditionary Air Force Headquarters and formerly Air Chief Marshal Tedder's scientific advisor in the Mediterranean, had produced a detailed analysis showing that bombing the railway infrastructure of northern France and Belgium before D-Day could paralyze the German ability to rush reinforcements to Normandy. If those railways were wrecked before the landing, German armoured divisions that might otherwise reach the beaches in 24 to 48 hours would instead take a week or more to arrive. Tedder carried the plan to Eisenhower, who backed it without hesitation. But the transportation plan was bitterly contested. The commander of the RAF bomber force, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, wanted to keep bombing German industrial cities. The American strategic bombing general Karl Spaatz wanted to attack German oil production. Winston Churchill opposed the plan on humanitarian grounds, worried that bombing French rail yards could kill tens of thousands of French civilians, citizens of an Allied nation already suffering under occupation. Eisenhower's position was unambiguous and uncompromising. He dictated a memo on March 22, 1944, stating that if the dispute were not settled at once, he would request relief from this command. He was prepared to resign as Supreme Commander rather than go into Normandy without control of the strategic bombers. The threat was not a bluff. It worked. By April 14, 1944, the Strategic Air Forces had formally passed to Eisenhower's direction. A captured German Air Ministry document, dated June 13, 1944, 1 week after D-Day, confirmed that the bombing campaign had caused the breakdown of all main railway lines in the region. On May 15, 1944, Eisenhower gathered the Allied High Command, along with King George VI, Winston Churchill, and senior members of the War Cabinet, for a final major planning conference at St. Paul's School in London. Montgomery walked the commanders through the plan. Churchill, who had spent years opposing the cross-channel strategy, made a declaration that Eisenhower recorded carefully in his memoir. Churchill said he was hardening towards this enterprise, meaning that after years of doubt, he had finally come to believe this was the right course of action. Eisenhower spoke after Montgomery and told everyone present that it was their duty to raise any flaw in the plan without hesitation. Once the men were ashore, there would be no second chance. Running alongside all of this was one of the most elaborate deception operations in military history. Operation Fortitude was designed to convince the German High Command that the main Allied landing would strike the Pas de Calais, more than 200 kilometers northeast of the actual Normandy beaches. Allied intelligence created a fictitious army, the 1st United States Army Group, notionally commanded by General George Patton, whom the Germans regarded as the most dangerous Allied commander. Double-cross agents fed fabricated reports to German intelligence handlers. The most important of these agents was a Spaniard named Juan Pujol Garcia, codename Garbo, whose entirely fictional network of sub-agents in Britain was providing Berlin with a consistent and carefully constructed lie. On approximately June 1, 1944, Allied codebreakers deciphered a cable from the Japanese ambassador in Berlin, reporting on his conversations with Hitler. The cable confirmed that Hitler still expected the main Allied blow to fall at the Pas de Calais. The deception was holding. Two crises in the final weeks before D-Day tested Eisenhower more severely than any of the political battles of the spring. The first came at the end of May. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory visited Eisenhower's headquarters and brought alarming intelligence. New German unit dispositions had placed the 91st Air Landing Division directly inside the planned American airborne drop zones on the Cotentin Peninsula, west of the main beaches. Lee Mallory told Eisenhower he predicted roughly 50% casualties among the paratroopers and losses as high as 70% among the glider troops. He described the planned operation as a futile slaughter and asked that it be cancelled. The decision rested with Eisenhower alone. The airborne drops were central to the entire Overlord plan. Without American paratroopers securing the western flank of the invasion, the assault at Utah Beach was exposed to a devastating German counterattack before the beachhead could be consolidated. If Utah failed, the entire lodgment was in danger, but if the airborne went in and Lee Mallory's predictions proved accurate, Eisenhower would have destroyed two elite American divisions in a single night for nothing. He spent the night alone with the problem. He consulted the airborne commanders. He reviewed the intelligence. He made his decision. He wrote his reply to Lee Mallory confirming that the airborne attack was essential to the whole operation and must go forward. He later described this decision in his memoir with a phrase that has never lost its weight. He called it, without exaggeration, a more soul-racking problem than he could easily conceive. The second crisis arrived with the Channel weather. The tidal and lunar conditions required for the Normandy landings were precise and unforgiving. The assault needed low tide at first light, so that the beach obstacles would be exposed and the landing craft could navigate between them. It needed a near full moon to allow the airborne forces to navigate in the dark. This combination recurred on only 3 days in each lunar month. In June of 1944, those days were the 5th, 6th, and 7th. The next workable window was June 18th through 20th. After that, the cycle reset. Eisenhower's meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg of the Royal Air Force, was a careful Scottish scientist who had been given the near-impossible task of forecasting Channel weather 5 days in advance. He synthesized reports from 3 competing teams, one at Dunstable, run by the British Met Office, one at Bushy Park near London, run by the United States Army Strategic Air Forces, and one at the Admiralty run by the Royal Navy. The 3 teams frequently disagreed. The Bushy Park team under Irving Crick, an American forecaster who believed weather patterns repeated themselves in predictable cycles, consistently produced more optimistic forecasts than the British teams. Sverre Pettersen, a Norwegian meteorologist working with the British team at Dunstable, thought Crick's methodology was fundamentally unsound, and said so plainly. Stagg found himself mediating between scientists who held genuinely incompatible views about what was happening over the North Atlantic, while a supreme commander waited for an answer that would set history in motion. Critical data came from a weather ship stationed far out in the Atlantic, and from a post office at Blacksod Point in County Mayo in neutral Ireland, where a young woman named Maureen Flavin took the meteorological readings that provided the first warning of the approaching storm. Her readings on June 3rd, 1944, which happened to be her 21st birthday, showed a falling barometer and the first signs of the deep depression moving in from the Atlantic. The data flowed from Blacksod to Stagg's team, where it helped confirm what the pessimistic British forecasters had been warning about. Stagg later wrote that when he was expected to present an agreed forecast to Eisenhower in less than half an hour, had the situation not been so charged with potential tragedy, the whole business would have seemed almost ridiculous. By June 4th, the weather had turned catastrophic. At the early morning meeting on June 4th, Stagg confirmed Force 5 winds across the Channel and cloud bases between 0 and 500 feet. These conditions would have blinded the Allied air forces and made the beach landings nearly impossible. Eisenhower postponed the invasion 24 hours, from June 5th to June 6th. Ships already at sea were recalled. A convoy of American landing craft carrying armor and follow-on troops of the 4th Infantry Division for Utah Beach was already 30 miles south of the Isle of Wight and had to be turned back in heavy seas. That evening, as the storm raged and the commanders waited at Southwick House, Stagg entered the room and said that conditions over the North Atlantic had changed unexpectedly and rapidly. A cold front was passing through. Behind it would come a brief window of tolerable weather, cloud bases between 2,000 and 3,000 feet, winds dropping to force 3 or 4, enough for the bombers and the fleet. The window would open on the night of June 5th and hold through the morning of June 6th. Then the weather would close again. Admiral Ramsay told Eisenhower the decision could not wait. If the order was not given within half an hour, the tides and timing would make June 7th impossible. The next opportunity would be June 18th. Eisenhower went around the room. Montgomery said go. Ramsay said go. Bedell Smith called it a helluva gamble. Tedder and Lee Mallory were uneasy but did not block the decision. Eisenhower said he needed to think until the morning. The provisional word was go. The final confirmation would come at the dawn meeting. He drove back through the mud and the rain to his trailer in the woods and tried to sleep. Eisenhower rose at 3:30 in the morning, was driven through the storm the short distance to Southwick House, and arrived in time for the 4:15 meeting. The commanders were waiting. Stagg delivered a forecast that was cautiously positive. He said conditions were moving in the direction of optimism. Eisenhower polled the room a final time. Every man said go. Then Eisenhower stood. He clasped his hands behind his back and began pacing the blue carpet, his chin on his chest, in silence. He stopped. He said what he said. In a filmed interview recorded with Walter Cronkite in 1963 for a documentary broadcast on June 6, 1964, conducted in that very room at Southwick House, Eisenhower described his reasoning in that moment. He said he had thought it was just the best of a bad bargain. That was how the decision felt to him. Not triumph, not confidence. The clear-eyed acceptance that there was no better option, that the time for deciding had arrived, and that the deciding was his alone to do. The room emptied in seconds. Commanders who had been carrying the weight of months were already moving, already issuing the orders that would set in motion the largest military enterprise in human history. Eisenhower did not sit down. He had something else to do first. On the evening of June 5, 1944, he drove roughly 40 miles north to a United States Army Air Force's airfield near Newbury in Berkshire, officially known as Station 486, RAF, Greenham Common. He had ordered the 4-star plates removed from his staff car. He wanted as little ceremony as possible. He had planned to visit both American airborne divisions that evening, but the commanders of the 82nd Airborne asked him to stay away rather than distract their men from final preparations. So he went to the 101st alone. The airfield was staging men of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, who would be in German-occupied France before sunrise. They were loading equipment into C-47 transport aircraft. Their faces were blackened for the night operation. Their parachutes were fitted. Their weapons were loaded. These were young men, many barely past their teens, who understood in general terms what was about to happen to them and were going anyway. His naval aide, Captain Harry Butcher, recorded that Eisenhower wandered through them, stepping over packs, guns, and a variety of equipment. He stopped and talked to one man and then another. He was recognized immediately. A soldier from Texas offered him a job after the war. Another called out, "Quit worrying, General. We'll take care of this thing for you." A Signal Corps photographer captured the moment now most associated with that evening. The photograph shows Eisenhower in the fading light, speaking to a young first lieutenant named Wallace Strobel from Saginaw, Michigan. Strobel was the jump master for Chalk No. 23, the designation for his assigned aircraft, and wore a cardboard placard around his neck, bearing that number so his men could find him in the confusion of the airfield. It was his 22nd birthday. For decades after the war, the caption attached to this photograph described Eisenhower delivering some kind of final inspirational address, rallying the men to glory. Strobel, who survived the war, set the record straight in his own words, published in American Heritage magazine in 1990 and repeated in later television interviews. What Eisenhower actually said was far simpler. He asked where Strobel was from. "Strobel," said Michigan. Eisenhower said he used to fish there. Great fishing in Michigan. He asked whether Strobel had been properly briefed. Strobel said yes. Eisenhower said good and moved on to the next man. Strobel reflected later that the visit was ultimately more useful to Eisenhower's morale than to the paratroopers. He said the men of the 101st were already so determined and so focused that the general left looking steadier than when he had arrived. Eisenhower remained at the airfield until the last aircraft had taken off. The C-47s began their takeoff rolls at 11-second intervals, shortly before midnight, climbing out under the moon into the darkness over the channel. Kay Summersby, his driver, watched his face as the planes went. Merrill Mueller, a correspondent for the National Broadcasting Company, stood beside him. Both recorded afterward that there were tears in his eyes. He said nothing until the runway was empty. Then he said, "Well, it's on." On the drive back through the dark to his trailer in the woods, he told Summersby it was very hard to look a soldier in the eye when you feared you were sending him to his death. He wrote in his memoir that the men at Greenham Common had joshingly assured him he had no cause for worry, that the 101st was on the job, and everything would be taken care of in fine shape. He wrote that he had stayed until the last of them were in the air, somewhere about midnight. Then he returned to his trailer alone, sat down, and waited for the first word from Normandy. Sometime between the final go decision in the morning and the drive to Greenham Common in the evening, Eisenhower had sat alone with a small notepad and a pencil and written a message he hoped he would never need to deliver. The message was fewer than 70 words. He dated it, in error, July 5th, 1944, when it should have read June 5th. He folded the paper and put it in his wallet. The full text of that message, preserved today at the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, reads as follows. Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air and the navy, did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. The edits visible on the original pencil draft tell the story of a man thinking precisely about what he was writing. He first wrote the passive construction. The troops have been withdrawn. He crossed it out and rewrote it in the active voice. I have withdrawn the troops. He began the second sentence with the phrase, this particular operation, and then crossed that out too, replacing it with, my decision to attack at this time and place. He drew a heavy pencil line beneath the final two words, mine alone. Every revision moved the weight further toward himself. He was not writing propaganda or preparing a legal defense. He was writing an honest account of where responsibility would reside if the worst happened. He was writing for a world in which June 6, 1944, would be remembered as a catastrophe. He almost threw the note away on July 11, 1944, when he reviewed his wallet and found it still there. His naval aide, Captain Butcher, asked to keep it. The note survived. It is one of the most significant pieces of paper produced by the Second World War, and every pencil mark remains visible on it today. Other commanders in other eras had faced similar moments. In the hours before the Battle of Waterloo in June of 1815, the Duke of Wellington had spent a night of profound uncertainty, wondering whether the Prussian army would arrive in time, telling a visitor the battle would be the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. He was right by a margin measured in hours. In June of 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz had risked the entire United States Pacific carrier force at Midway on intelligence that might have been wrong. In both cases, a single human being stood at the point where the plan met reality and accepted what came next. What distinguished Eisenhower was not that he faced this weight, but that he named it so directly. The note in his wallet was not something he showed to anyone. It was something he wrote for himself, an act of moral clarity, making explicit in writing what he already understood. The men going toward those beaches were going because of a decision he had made. If they failed, the responsibility would not flow downward to the soldiers who had carried out his orders. It would remain where it had always been. The men who had told Eisenhower he was wrong were about to be proven wrong themselves. On June 7, 1944, one day after the landings, Leigh Mallory wrote Eisenhower a letter acknowledging that his prediction of catastrophic airborne casualties had not come true. He told Eisenhower he was sorry for having added to his burdens. He said he had been wrong. The actual losses among the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions amounted to roughly 2,500 casualties out of approximately 13,000 paratroopers who dropped, a rate somewhere between 15 and 19%. This was a fraction of the 50% figure Leigh Mallory had predicted. The scattering of paratroopers across the Cotentin Peninsula that he had feared would be disastrous had actually worked in the Allies' favor. It confused German defenders, disrupted their communications, and produced a web of improvised American resistance across a wide area that tied down multiple German units and bought time for the beach landings to consolidate. Eisenhower later wrote that Leigh Mallory's letter was one of the few he had kept from the entire war. James Stagg's weather window held exactly as he had predicted. The channel was tolerable on the night of June 5th and through the morning of June 6th. The cloud cover was high enough for the Allied bombers. The winds were light enough for the fleet. Then the weather closed again, exactly as Stagg had warned. Between June 19th and 22nd, 1944, the English Channel was struck by the worst storm in 40 years. The storm completely destroyed the American artificial harbour off Omaha Beach. Had Eisenhower postponed the invasion to the June 18th window, his fleet would have been caught at sea in that storm, not sheltering in harbour. Eisenhower later told Stagg, "I thank the gods of war we went when we did." The deception held longer than anyone had dared hope. The German 15th Army, holding the Pas de Calais, remained in position for 7 weeks after the Normandy landings, waiting for the main invasion that fortitude had convinced them was still coming. Rommel was not there to direct the German response. He had driven home to Herrlingen near Ulm on June 4th to spend his wife Lucy's 50th birthday with her. He was still at home on the morning of June 6th when his Chief of Staff Hans Speidel telephoned with news of the invasion. Rommel set off back to France immediately and arrived at his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon that same evening, far too late to influence the critical first hours. Adolf Hitler slept late on June 6th and did not release the armoured reserve from German high command control until late afternoon. The units released at that point, the 12th SS Panzer Division and the Panzer Lehr Division, were then caught in the open by Allied aircraft as they moved toward the front. Lead elements did not reach the Normandy fighting until June 7th, by which time the beachhead was established. The 21st Panzer Division, which was under Army Group B control rather than the held-back reserve, did counterattack in the gap between the British Sword and Juno beaches on the afternoon of June 6th. A battle group under Colonel Josef Rauch actually reached the coast at Lyon-sur-Mer around 8 in the evening, linking briefly with isolated German strongpoints, representing the closest the Germans came to splitting the Allied beachhead on D-Day. But the appearance overhead of more than 250 British gliders of the 6th Air Landing Brigade, landing east of the Orne River as part of Operation Mallard, convinced the divisional commander General Feuchtinger that airborne forces were about to encircle him. He ordered withdrawal. With no infantry reinforcements coming forward from the battered 76th Infantry Division and the main armoured thrust already stopped on Perrier's Ridge, the opportunity closed before midnight. The division lost roughly 70 of its 124 tanks that day. The strategic consequences of this German command failure were profound. Rommel had been right that the battle would be decided in the first hours. But the combination of Allied deception, Hitler's delayed decision, the absence of Rommel himself, and Allied air power hammering the approach roads, meant that those first hours went entirely to the Allies. On D-Day itself, June 6, 1944, the confirmed Allied dead numbered approximately 4,414 men. Total casualties, including the wounded, missing and captured, reached approximately 10,000. It was a terrible price, and it was a price that purchased something real. By nightfall on June 6th, 5 Allied divisions were ashore across 5 beaches on a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast, and the liberation of Western Europe had begun. By July 25, 1944, roughly 1,500, Allied heavy bombers struck a narrow German-held corridor west of Saint-Lô in an operation codenamed Cobra, breaking open the front that had been locked in brutal hedgerow fighting for 7 weeks. By July 30th, American forces had driven through to Avranches. By August 1st, General George Patton's Third Army had activated and was sweeping east and south with a speed that stunned the German command. Paris fell on August 25, 1944. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The documents Eisenhower created in those weeks have outlasted every army he commanded and every fleet his forces sailed. The order of the day, his printed address to the Allied Expeditionary Force beginning, "Soldiers, Sailors, and Airmen," was distributed as a leaflet to approximately 175,000 members of the invasion force on the eve of D-Day. It was broadcast by the BBC on the morning of June 6, 1944. American radio networks carried it at 3:32 in the morning, Eastern Wartime. 50,000 people gathered in Central Park in New York City that evening and heard it read aloud. Eisenhower had drafted it himself over weeks, starting in February of 1944. His own pencil edits are visible on surviving copies, and they reveal the same instinct that drove every other decision of the spring. He shifted the words, "The eyes of the world are upon you," from the end of the text to the opening line, because he wanted the soldiers reading it to feel that weight immediately, not as an afterthought. He replaced a weak closing line with, "We will accept nothing less than full victory," adding the exclamation mark himself. He crossed out "the great undertaking" and replaced it with "the great crusade." He was not writing a military memo. He was writing something that men would read in the hold of a ship on the night before the most frightening morning of their lives, and he wanted every word to carry its weight. He recorded a spoken version on May 28, 1944, when the invasion was still scheduled for late May or early June. The recording runs just under 2 minutes. His voice is calm and direct, Midwestern in its flatness, with none of the rhetorical flourishes of Churchill or Roosevelt. It sounds like a man who has thought carefully about what he wants to say and has said it plainly. The "in case of failure" note sits in a climate-controlled archive at the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, every pencil edit still visible. The heavy underline beneath the words, "mine alone," as clear today as the morning he drew it. The American Battle Monuments Commission maintains the Normandy American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, on the bluff overlooking Omaha Beach. 9,387 American servicemen are buried there, in neat rows of white marble crosses and stars of David. Every year on June 6th, ceremonies are held. Veterans attended those ceremonies for decades. Their numbers grew smaller each year. The last men who had been young on those beaches are very old now, or are gone. Their families and the leaders of nations whose freedom was purchased on those beaches continue to gather. Wallace Strobel, the young man from Saginaw, Michigan, who had talked fishing with Eisenhower on the tarmac at Greenham Common, survived the war and lived into old age. In recounting that evening later in life, he said he had not received a great speech. He had received a question about where he was from and a comment about fishing. And he believed, looking back across the decades, that the general had needed that moment as much as any man on that airfield. James Stagg, the meteorologist whose forecast made the invasion possible, wrote a full account of those days after the war. He described the impossibility of being asked to give a definitive answer when science offered only probabilities. He recalled that when he entered the Southwick House library for the final meeting on June 5th and delivered his cautiously optimistic forecast, the commanders in the room looked like new men. In 1964, 20 years after D-Day, Eisenhower returned to Normandy with Walter Cronkite for a documentary broadcast under the title D-Day Plus 20 Years. He walked on Omaha Beach and stood at the cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer. He was in his early 70s by then. He had served 2 terms as President of the United States. He had helped shape the post-war world. And standing on that beach, looking at the water, he said it was a wonderful thing to see. He said the spirit of the men who had gone in there was something he would never forget as long as he lived. He did not talk about strategy. He did not talk about his decisions or his forecasts or the note in his wallet. He talked about the men. He had always talked about the men. Here is what the record of those days actually shows. The decision to invade was not made on June 5, 1944. It had been made and remade, contested and defended, over months of planning, argument, threatened resignation, and sleepless nights. By the time Eisenhower paced that blue carpet and said what he said, he had already fought and won a dozen battles that most people have never heard of. He had forced the strategic bombers under his command against institutional resistance from Harris and Sparts. He had overruled Leigh Mallory's objection to the Airborne. He had held the Allied coalition together through friction that would have broken a lesser hand. He had expanded the invasion front, delayed the date to allow more preparation, and sustained the deception that kept the German 15th Army immobile for 7 weeks after the landings. What happened in that library was not a single act of leadership. It was the culmination of an entire process of leadership. The 4 words he said were the surface of something very deep. He understood that command at the highest level is not the exercise of power. It is the acceptance of weight, the weight of the decision, the weight of the consequences. The weight of the knowledge that however well you plan, however carefully you prepare, once the men are in the plains and the ships are on the water, the outcome is no longer in your hands. It is in theirs. He had come to believe that the irreducible core of leadership was the willingness to accept responsibility for the consequences of your own decisions, in full and in advance, without hedging, without escape routes, without the comfort of blaming subordinates when things went wrong. Everything about his conduct in those final days reflected that belief. The memo threatening resignation, the written confirmation to Lee Mallory, the note in his wallet, the drive to the airfield, the conversation about fishing with a young man from Michigan who had no idea his general was carrying a concession of failure folded in his pocket. He went to Greenham Common that evening not because it would change the military outcome. He went because he believed, as he told his driver afterward, that it was very hard to look a soldier in the eye when you feared you were sending him to his death. And he did it anyway. The worst did not come. The landings held, the beachhead expanded, the armies broke out and drove east, and the note in his wallet was never needed. But he had written it anyway, drawn that heavy pencil line, and then driven north through the dark to an airfield in Berkshire to talk to a young man about fishing, while 156,000 men's deliverance climbed into a sky that was, for just that one brief window of hours, clear enough to cross. That is what Eisenhower told his commanders before D-Day. That is what he wrote alone and carried in his wallet. And that is what, more than 80 years later, still has the power to stop you cold.